10,000 women rated this one handshake trait before anything else. First impression research shows that handshake firmness is one of the fastest and most consequential social signals people register, processed in under 2 seconds, influencing the entire interaction that follows, and operating through mechanisms that neither the man giving the handshake nor the woman receiving it is consciously aware of during the exchange itself. For men over 60, this 2-second moment either reinforces or undermines everything else their physical presence has been communicating. And the specific quality that makes the difference is almost never discussed in mainstream fitness or grooming content. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what's happening in those 2 seconds, and specifically how to ensure what's happening works in your favor. Something worth acknowledging up front. The handshake is a fading social ritual in some contexts and a persistent one in others. Professional introductions, social meetings, and the specific formal and semi-formal situations where first impressions carry the most consequential weight. In exactly those contexts, the 2 seconds of a handshake are doing more impression formation work than most men have ever quantified. And understanding what that work actually involves changes how seriously it deserves to be taken. Point 1. Why grip firmness is processed as a health and dominance cue before anything's said in the conversation. Here's the neuroscience behind why 2 seconds of physical contact with another person's hand can influence an interaction that lasts an hour. The brain's social assessment systems process touch-based information through pathways that are both faster and more primitive than those governing visual or verbal assessment. A firm, confident grip activates the same unconscious dominance and health assessment that physical presence and posture activate through a sensory pathway that reaches interpretive centers in the brain before conscious evaluation has had time to apply context, prior knowledge, or social courtesy. Research on handshake quality and first impression formation has found that observers given only a handshake with no visual information about the person's appearance and no verbal exchange form assessments of the person's health, confidence, and social dominance that correlate significantly with assessments formed from full social interactions lasting considerably longer. The handshake alone carries enough biologically meaningful information to anchor the impression that everything subsequent builds on rather than overrides. For men over 60, this matters specifically because the handshake is often the first physical contact in professional and social introductions, the moment where the physical vitality that training produces gets translated into direct sensory experience for another person. Everything visual about a man's presence has been communicating before this moment. The handshake either confirms or contradicts what visual processing has been suggesting, and research on impression consistency finds that confirming evidence lands differently than contradicting evidence. A firm handshake, confirming a vital physical presence, compounds the impression positively, while a weak handshake, contradicting a visually fit appearance, creates a cognitive inconsistency that undermines the visual impression more than most men anticipate. Point 2. The specific difference between a trained firm grip and an overcompensating crushing grip. Here's the distinction that separates a handshake that communicates genuine confidence from one that communicates anxiety dressed as aggression. And it's worth understanding precisely because the two produce opposite social outcomes, despite both feeling like strong handshakes to the man delivering them. Research on handshake quality and social perception has found that grip force follows a specific inverted U-shaped relationship with positive impression formation. Insufficient force, the limp, passive grip that registers as low confidence, produces the most negative impression. Optimal force, firm, engaged, confident without being effortful, produces the strongest positive impression. Excessive force, the crushing, white-knuckle grip that most men think of as maximally confident, produces a specifically negative impression distinct from the limp grip, registering not as confidence, but as social anxiety, overcompensation, or dominance performance that observers find uncomfortable and slightly threatening rather than genuinely commanding. The trained firm grip is characterized by full web-to-web contact, the soft skin between thumb and forefinger, making complete contact with the same region of the other person's hand before any gripping force is applied. Consistent force applied through the full hand rather than concentrated in the fingers, and a duration of 2 to 3 firm shakes before release. The overcompensating crush is characterized by excessive force concentrated in the fingers, a prolonged duration that overstays the social welcome of the gesture, and the visible muscular effort that signals the grip is being performed rather than naturally expressed. The trained firm grip comes from forearm strength and grip development that makes the appropriate force level natural rather than effortful. The same forearm training discussed in the forearm video in this series. Men who train their grip strength through farmer's carries and dead hangs develop a natural grip firmness that produces the optimal range automatically without needing to consciously modulate their force in the moment when conscious modulation is most likely to produce the overcompensating pattern. Point 3. The forearm and hand exercises that build a naturally confident grip without looking like effort. Here's where the training prescription for this specific social outcome becomes specific enough to act on immediately. The exercises producing a naturally confident grip, one that operates within the optimal range automatically rather than requiring conscious calibration, are the same grip-intensive compound movements discussed across this series. Farmer's carries, dead hangs, heavy pulling movements performed without lifting straps. Each of these builds the combined forearm musculature and grip endurance that produces the firm, sustained grip engagement the handshake requires, without the effortful concentration that makes the grip feel performed rather than natural. What these exercises specifically build that isolation grip training doesn't is the nervous system efficiency underlying grip. The speed and completeness of neural signal from intention to muscle activation that makes grip force production feel effortless rather than effortful. A man who can hold two 40-kilogram dumbbells in a farmer's carry for 45 seconds finds that sustaining a confident handshake grip for 3 seconds requires essentially no conscious effort, because the capacity is so far above the demand that the demand feels trivial rather than challenging. This distinction between capability that feels natural because the demand is well within comfortable range and capability that feels effortful because the demand is near the limit of what's available is exactly what separates the confident handshake from the compensating one in social perception. Observers unconsciously detect the difference between effortful and effortless force production through subtle cues in facial expression, breathing, and muscular tension that accompany the grip. And those cues determine whether the handshake reads as genuinely confident or as performance of confidence. This complete picture, connecting grip training to forearm development, to handshake quality, to first impression formation, and to the broader physical presence this channel has discussed across its entire content, is precisely what I built the Alpha Protocol Blueprint to deliver as one integrated system. Smart training protocols for men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, the V-taper technique, attraction science, grooming and cologne, nutrition and proportion, and hormonal optimization, all structured to produce physical results that translate into every social moment rather than staying confined to the gym. Scan the code on your screen now, or check the description and pinned comment for the link. Point 4. Why older men who let grip strength fade are perceived as declining, even when everything else looks fit. Here is the specific social consequence of grip strength decline that most men have never had articulated directly, and that explains a pattern some men notice without being able to identify its source. Research on age perception and physical capability assessment has found that grip firmness is weighted heavily in observers' unconscious estimation of a man's overall physical status, sometimes disproportionately to other physical signals. A man who looks visually fit but delivers a weak handshake creates a cognitive inconsistency that observers resolve by downgrading their assessment of his actual physical status rather than upgrading their assessment of his grip. The weak handshake reads as a more honest signal of his true biological status than the visual impression, because it's experienced rather than observed, and experiential data is processed as more reliable than visual data in most social assessment systems. This means that a visually impressive man with declining grip strength is likely being perceived as less physically vital than his appearance suggests, not by observers who consciously notice the inconsistency and reason through it, but by observers whose unconscious assessment systems have resolved it in the direction of the experiential data. The handshake undermines the visual impression rather than the visual impression compensating for the handshake. Bonus point: the professional consequence that extends this beyond attraction entirely. Here's the final finding that extends the impact of handshake quality into domains most men have never connected to grip training. Interview and hiring research has linked handshake quality to first impression ratings of competence and professionalism, specifically finding that handshake quality at the beginning of a job interview influenced the interviewer's overall assessment of the candidate in ways that persisted throughout the interview, and that the candidate's subsequent performance only partially compensated for. A strong, appropriate handshake created a positive context in which subsequent information was processed favorably. A weak handshake created a negative prior that required the candidate to actively overcome through demonstrated competence rather than having that competence assumed. For men over 60 in professional contexts, consultations, business introductions, professional networking, this finding means the handshake is doing professional impression work that most men have never attributed to it. The grip strength that training produces isn't only a longevity marker and an attraction signal. It's a professional credential delivered in 2 seconds before a single word of the conversation has established anything about capability or experience. Try the gallon jug test described in the Forearm video if you haven't already. Then spend 6 weeks on farmers' carries and dead hangs 3 times weekly, and pay attention to whether your handshake feels qualitatively different, more effortless, more naturally firm, less like something you have to think about. Comment handshake below after 6 weeks, and tell me what you noticed. The connection between the training and the social moment is one most men feel more clearly than they expected once they experience it directly. Here's the complete picture. Grip firmness is processed as a health and dominance cue through faster, more primitive pathways than visual or verbal information, anchoring the impression that the entire subsequent interaction builds on. Optimal grip force follows an inverted U shape, where excessive force reads as overcompensation rather than confidence, and trained grip strength produces the optimal range naturally without conscious modulation. Farmers' carries and dead hangs build the nervous system efficiency that makes appropriate grip force feel effortless rather than effortful. A weak handshake from a visually fit man creates a cognitive inconsistency that observers resolve by downgrading their physical assessment, making grip decline undermine visual presence more than most men realize. The Alpha Protocol Blueprint integrates grip training within a complete physical and social presence system. And handshake quality influences professional competence assessments in ways that persist throughout interactions, making it a professional credential delivered in 2 seconds before the conversation has established anything. 2 seconds. That's the entire window. Train for it accordingly. Subscribe to StyleConnection for content that takes every dimension of physical presence seriously enough to explain what's actually happening in the moments most men have never examined closely enough to understand. Hit the bell, like this if the professional dimension of handshake quality surprised you, and share it with someone whose grip strength deserves more deliberate attention than it's currently getting. The next video is waiting for you on screen. See you there.